Give me the keys. Now. The voice was a rasp, trying for menace but landing on desperation. It came from her left, low and close to her ear. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap beer rolled off him. That was the first thing she noticed. The smell. The scene was painfully ordinary. A Sunoco station off a state highway, the air thick with the humid promise of a July afternoon. Fluorescent lights hummed over the pumps, casting a sterile glow that fought with the hazy sunlight. Two other cars were fueling up, their occupants ghosts behind tinted glass. A young man with headphones sat behind the counter inside, staring at his phone. Four men, one at her ear, another blocking the driver's side door of her sensible sedan. Two more leaning against a rusted pickup truck by the air pump, watching. Waiting. Their postures were a study in performative authority, hands tucked into jacket pockets, chins jutting out. Phones were starting to rise from the dashboards of the other cars, small dark lenses aimed at her. She did not turn. She did not flinch. Her hands, which had been reaching for the gas cap, remained in the open, fingers slightly curled. Calm, visible. She simply stood, her gaze fixed on the peeling paint of pump number 3, her breath a slow, measured thing. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, she cataloged the exits, the angles, the threats. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes, both hostile and curious. She felt the heat rising from the asphalt. What they didn't know was that they had just tried to rob Deputy U.S. Marshal Lena Washington. What they didn't know was that they had mistaken 48 years of discipline for weakness. What they didn't know was that their day was about to end and hers was just beginning. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The day had begun with light. The specific quality of Carolina morning light, soft and golden, filtering through the 100-year-old oak trees that stood guard outside her father's house. It was the light she remembered from childhood, a light that seemed to hold both memory and promise. Lena Washington stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water as she washed the skillet from breakfast. Outside, cicadas were already beginning their relentless pulsing hymn. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming gardenias. It was peaceful. It was home. She had 14 days of leave remaining, 14 days carved out of a life spent in federal courthouses, fugitive task force briefings, and the sterile quiet of government vehicles. 14 days to be a daughter again. She dried her hands on a worn dish towel, the fabric soft from 1,000 washings. Her father, Judge Elijah Washington, retired, sat at the heavy oak table in the breakfast nook, the local paper spread before him like a sacred text. He was 82, his frame thinner than it once was, but his eyes, behind thick bifocal glasses, were as sharp and discerning as they had been on the bench. He folded a section of the paper with a precise, deliberate motion that she had seen him use with legal briefs and sentencing guidelines. "They're trying to rezone the old mill property," he said, not looking up. His voice was a low rumble, the gravel of age smoothed by a lifetime of measured elocution. "Developer from Charlotte. Wants to put up luxury condos." Lena poured herself another cup of coffee. The aroma was rich and dark, a comfort. "Let me guess. The council is falling all over themselves to approve it. Like it's the second coming." He tapped a finger on the paper. "They talk about progress. They talk about the tax base. They don't talk about the folks in the hollow who will be priced out of their homes within a decade. It's the same old machine, Lena, just with a new coat of paint." The machine, that was her father's term for it. The interconnected systems of power and money and influence that operated just beneath the surface of things, grinding away at the foundations of community and justice. He had fought the machine from his seat on the bench for 40 years. She fought it in the field, one fugitive, one warrant, one quiet act of federal authority at a time. They were in the same business, really, the business of holding the line. She sat opposite him, the worn wood of the table cool against her forearms. "What are you going to do?" He finally looked up, a slow smile touching the corners of his mouth. "What I've always done. I'll make some calls. I'll draft a letter. Mrs. Gable from the Historical Society has been keeping records for 20 years. We have documentation." He looked at her over the rim of his glasses, his expression turning serious. "Documentation, Lena. It's the only weapon that lasts. Everything else is just noise." She nodded. She had learned that lesson from him a long time ago. Keep records. Trust the paper trail. Build the case. Emotion was a fire that burned out. Evidence was stone. For the next hour, they sat in comfortable silence. The only sounds, the rustle of the newspaper, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, and the distant drone of a lawnmower. This was the ritual of her visits, the quiet moments that refilled a well of strength inside her that the job constantly threatened to drain. She watched the way the light moved across the floor, the dust motes dancing in its beams. She memorized the lines on her father's face, the familiar cadence of his breathing. These were the things she fought for. Not abstract concepts of law and order, but this table, this light, this man. Around 10 o'clock, she stood and rinsed her cup. I need to run to the store, and the car needs gas. You need anything? Get some of that sharp cheddar from the deli, he said, his eyes already back on the paper. And be careful. Always am, Dad. She took her keys from the small ceramic bowl by the door. Her service weapon was locked in a safe in her bedroom, as per regulations when off duty and not on official travel. Her credentials were in her wallet. Her mind, her body, her training. Those were always with her. She walked out into the humid morning, to the screen door slapping shut behind her. Her car, a 5-year-old Toyota Camry, was the picture of unassuming reliability. It was gray, clean, and utterly forgettable. It was a perfect car for a woman who spent her life moving through the world without drawing attention. She got in, the interior warm from the sun. The engine turned over with a quiet hum. Just the road and the engine and the morning air. Simple, normal. She backed out of the long gravel driveway, past the towering oaks and the perfectly tended rose bushes her mother had planted 30 years ago. The world felt solid, predictable. It was a feeling she knew was an illusion, but one she cherished all the same. The drive to the gas station was 5 miles of 2-lane blacktop that wound through rolling farmland and stands of pine. She drove with the windows down, the air whipping through the car, carrying the scent of cut grass and diesel. She passed the sign for the old mill, a faded placard half swallowed by kudzu. She saw the machine. She drove on. The Sunoco was just ahead, an island of concrete and commerce in a sea of green. It looked like any of 1,000 other gas stations she had passed in her life. She signaled, slowed, and turned into the lot, pulling up to pump number 3. She didn't need anyone to tell her what was about to happen. The world was about to remind her that peace was temporary, and the line she held was everywhere. She let herself feel the ordinariness of the moment for exactly 3 more seconds. The click of the seatbelt release, the familiar weight of her purse, the slight squeak of the car door. Then she stepped out into the hazy sunlight, and the man with the stale cigarette breath stepped out of the shadows. The man's voice, the one at her ear, repeated his demand. Louder this time, an edge of frayed temper creeping in. I said, give me the keys and the wallet. Don't be a hero. Lena kept her eyes forward. She could feel his body heat behind her, too close, a violation of space that was as much a threat as his words. She could see the other man, the one by her door, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He was younger, maybe 20, his face a mask of nervous bravado. He had a tattoo of a spiderweb on his neck. The 2 by the pickup hadn't moved. They were the anchors, the Overwatch, a classic 4-person box-in. Amateurish in its execution, but the intent was clear. She took a slow, deliberate breath, filling her lungs, steadying her heart rate. Her training kicked in, a calm, cold river flowing through her veins. Assess, comply, control, survive. Okay, she said. Her voice was even, calm, not a whisper, not a plea, a statement of fact. Okay. She made a slow, visible movement, reaching her right hand toward her purse on the passenger seat. No, the man behind her barked. Get it yourself. He shoved his companion forward, the younger one with the tattoo. The kid stumbled, catching himself on the car door. He looked at Lena, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Just give it to me, he stammered. Lena looked at him. Really looked at him? She saw the tremor in his hands, the way his gaze darted from her to the man behind her and back again. He was the weak link. There was always a weak link. My wallet is in the purse, she said, speaking directly to the kid. My keys are in my left pocket. She spoke slowly, distinctly, as if giving instructions to a child. She was controlling the rhythm of the encounter. The man behind her grew impatient. "Stop talking to him. Just get the stuff, idiot." The kid fumbled with the purse, his hands clumsy. He pulled out her wallet. It was a simple leather billfold. He opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. He saw a driver's license, a few credit cards, $63 in cash. He didn't see the badge. Her credentials were in a separate, hidden flap. One you had to know was there. He wouldn't find it with a clumsy, panicked search. He pulled the cash out and tossed the wallet onto the seat. "Keys," he said, his voice cracking. Lena maintained eye contact with him. She moved her left hand with painstaking slowness toward her pocket. Her movements were designed to be non-threatening, predictable. She was giving them no reason to escalate to physical violence. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. The distance to the men at the truck was approximately 30 feet. The attendant inside was still oblivious. The other customers were now prisoners in their own cars, witnesses. One, a woman in a minivan, was visibly holding her phone up, recording. "Good. Documentation." She pulled the keys from her pocket, holding them out between her thumb and forefinger. The kid snatched them from her hand. "All right, we got it. Let's go," he said, turning to the man behind Lena. But the leader wasn't satisfied. Something in Lena's composure, her utter lack of fear, had gotten under his skin. It was an affront to his sense of power. He stepped around her, getting in her face. He was taller than her by a few inches, his face pockmarked and sallow. The smell of him was overwhelming. "You think you're something special?" he sneered, his voice low and menacing. He crowded her space, forcing her to take a half step back against the car. This was a dominance play, a performance for his crew and for the unseen audience. "I think you have what you came for," Lena said, her voice still infuriatingly calm. She did not break eye contact. She did not shrink away. She stood her ground, a granite pillar of composure. "Maybe we don't," he said, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "Maybe we want the car, too. Get in. You're driving." That was the moment the line was crossed. Robbery was one thing. Kidnapping was another. The calculus in her mind shifted instantly. The objective was no longer de-escalation. It was incapacitation. But before she could act, a new sound cut through the tense air. A siren, faint at first, but growing rapidly closer. The effect on the four men was immediate. The leader's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. The nervous kid dropped the keys, which clattered on the pavement. The two by the truck, who had been enjoying the show, suddenly looked like cornered animals. Their easy confidence evaporated, replaced by raw fear. The leader grabbed the front of Lena's shirt. "You called them! You called the cops!" he hissed, his face inches from hers. "I didn't have to," Lena said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You did, with all this noise." A local police cruiser, a Ford Explorer, screamed into the gas station lot, its lights painting the scene in strobing flashes of red and blue. It fishtailed to a stop, blocking the only exit. The car door flew open and a single officer emerged. He was a big man. His uniform stretched tight across his chest and belly. Mid-40s, white, with a military-style haircut that was starting to thin on top. He drew his service weapon as he exited the vehicle, holding it in a two-handed grip. His behavioral signature was immediate, hand on holster before speaking. His eyes swept the scene, taking in the four white men and the one black woman, and in that instant he made his decision. He constructed his narrative. "Police, everybody on the ground, now!" he bellowed, his voice amplified by adrenaline and a sense of his own authority. The four men, seeing their opportunity, immediately dropped to the ground, hands spread wide on the pavement. It was a practiced, almost theatrical surrender. The leader even managed to look frightened, victimized. Lena did not move. She remained standing by her car, her hands held up and open, away from her body. She knew what was happening. She had seen this play out 100 times. The machine was starting to grind. The officer, whose name tag read Miller, advanced on the scene, his weapon still trained not on the four men on the ground, but on the one person left standing. On her. "Ma'am, I said on the ground," he shouted, his voice tight with aggression. "Officer," Lena began, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the noise of the idling cruiser and the panicked breathing of the men on the ground. "These men were attempting to rob me." Officer Miller stopped about 10 feet from her. He had a smirk on his face, the kind of contemptuous expression she had seen on 1,000 faces just like his. It was the smirk of a man who held all the power and knew it. Is that right? And I suppose these four gentlemen just decided to lie down on the hot asphalt for a nap. He gestured with his gun toward the men. You four stay right where you are. He turned his full attention back to Lena. I'm going to say this one more time. Get on the ground. She had a choice. She could comply physically, get on the ground, and allow him to continue with his flawed, dangerous assumption. Or she could assert herself and risk escalating the situation with an armed, agitated officer who had already made up his mind about who the threat was. She had learned a long time ago that for a black woman in a situation like this, either choice could be fatal, but one choice preserved her dignity. Officer, she said again, her voice losing none of its steadiness, my name is Lena Washington. I am the victim here. I'll be the judge of that, Miller snapped. He was performing now. For the witnesses in their cars, for the young man who had finally emerged from the convenience store, his phone held high. You are failing to comply with a lawful order. That's resisting arrest. Now get down. He saw a black woman. He saw four white men on the ground who looked like they could be his nephews or his neighbor's sons. He didn't see a crime in progress. He saw a dispute he had to settle, and his instincts, honed by years of bias and departmental culture, told him exactly who was to blame. That wasn't just a mistake. That was the machine working as designed. Lena slowly, deliberately lowered herself to one knee, not all the way to the ground. It was a compromise, a concession but not a surrender. She kept her hands visible. This act of partial compliance seemed to enrage Miller even more. It was a challenge to his absolute authority. I said on the ground, all the way. He holstered his weapon and unclipped his handcuffs, advancing on her. That's it. You're under arrest. On what charge? Lena asked. The question was precise, legal. It was the kind of question a person who knew the law would ask. The question stopped him for a fraction of a second. He had been running on pure bluster, and the calm, specific query threw him off his rhythm. Resisting arrest. Disorderly conduct. We'll figure it out at the station. He reached for her arm, and that was the moment she decided the lesson would begin. Officer Miller, she said, her voice still quiet, yet it seemed to cut through the air and command the space. Before you touch me, you need to know that you are interfering in a federal matter, and you are about to commit a felony. Miller laughed, a short, ugly bark of a laugh. A federal matter? Lady, this is a gas station in my town. Now give me your hands. He grabbed her left wrist. His grip was rough, bruising. Lena did not resist physically. She let him pull her arm behind her back, but she kept talking. These men, she said, nodding her head toward the four accomplices on the pavement, attempted to rob me at gunpoint, though they did not display the weapon. They then attempted to kidnap me. That makes this a carjacking, which is a federal crime under the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, specifically 18 U.S. Code, Section 2119. Miller paused, the first flicker of uncertainty moving behind his eyes. The specificity of her language, the citation of the federal code, was not what he expected. But he was in too deep now to back down. His pride and his audience wouldn't allow it. You can tell your story to the judge, sweetheart, he grunted, fumbling with the handcuffs. Right now, you're coming with me. That would be a mistake, Lena said. The temperature of her voice had dropped several degrees. It was no longer calm, it was cold. Because in about 90 seconds, your dispatcher is going to get a call from the U.S. Marshal Service asking why one of their officers is being unlawfully detained by a local police officer. And then your day is going to get very, very complicated. She let the words hang in the air. She watched the calculation happening on his face. He was weighing the ludicrous possibility that she was telling the truth against a certain humiliation of backing down now. His ego won. Yeah, right, he sneered, finally getting the first cuff around her wrist. And I'm the Queen of England. The click of the steel ratchet was unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. She felt the cold metal bite into her skin, not from fear, from a deep, righteous anger held in perfect check. She had given him every chance to do his job correctly. He had refused. He had chosen this path. Officer, she said, her voice now barely a whisper, a blade of ice. My credentials are in my wallet, in the hidden flap behind the driver's license. My badge number is 714. My name is Deputy U.S. Marshal Lena Washington, and you have just made the biggest mistake of your career." As if on cue, Miller's radio crackled to life on his shoulder. The dispatcher's voice was tinny, but the urgency was unmistakable. "Car 21, what's your status? We have a call coming in from the U.S. Marshal's Eastern District Command. They're asking about a Deputy Marshal Washington at your location. Is that the female suspect you have detained?" The blood drained from Officer Miller's face. His hand, which had been moving to secure the second cuff, froze in midair. He stared at Lena, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the unshakable composure, the quiet authority that he had mistaken for arrogance. He saw the profound, unnerving stillness in her eyes. He saw not a suspect, but a predator who had patiently allowed him to walk into her trap. The silence that followed lasted about 10 seconds. In those 10 seconds, the entire power dynamic of the Sunoco gas station inverted itself. The four men on the ground, who had been enjoying the show, now looked at Lena with a new kind of terror. The witnesses in their cars lowered their phones, a collective sense of shock rippling through the small crowd. And Officer Miller felt the cold dread of a man who has just realized he has stepped off a cliff and has not yet begun to fall. He let go of her arm as if it were burning hot. His hands fumbled as he reached for the key to the handcuffs. His movements were no longer confident and aggressive, but clumsy and panicked. "Ma'am, I didn't know," he stammered, his voice a pathetic shadow of its earlier bellow. Lena did not reply. She simply waited, her cuffed wrist held out behind her, her gaze fixed on him. She let him struggle. She let him sweat under the weight of what he had done. This was part of the lesson, too. The humiliation, the dawning horror of consequence. He finally managed to unlock the cuff. He stepped back, creating a wide berth around her, as if she were radioactive. He looked at the four men on the ground, then back at her, his mind struggling to recalibrate a world that had been turned upside down. You stay here?" he said to her, though it sounded more like a plea than an order. He turned his attention to the original perpetrators, his voice regaining a fraction of its authority as he focused on the easier targets. "You four, don't you move a muscle." Another patrol car was arriving, this one followed by a supervisor's vehicle. Two more officers and a sergeant spilled out, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. They saw Miller, pale and shaken. They saw the four men on the ground, and they saw Lena, standing tall and uncuffed, a figure of immense, silent power in the center of the chaos. The sergeant, a man with graying temples and tired eyes, approached cautiously. "Miller, what the hell is going on here?" Before Miller could formulate an answer, Lena spoke. "Sergeant," she said, her voice calm and authoritative, taking command of the scene. "My name is Deputy U.S. Marshal Lena Washington. These four individuals," she gestured to the men on the ground, "attempted an armed robbery and carjacking. Your officer," she looked pointedly at Miller, "mistook me for the perpetrator and wrongfully detained me." The sergeant looked from Lena to Miller's ashen face and back again. He had been a cop for 25 years. He knew the look of a colossal screw-up when he saw one. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch. Confirm the identity of a U.S. Marshal Washington. Badge 714, Eastern District." While they waited for the confirmation, Lena walked over to her car. She reached in and retrieved her wallet from the passenger seat. With practiced efficiency, she opened the hidden flap and produced her credentials. The golden badge and the official ID card seemed to gleam in the afternoon sun. She held it out for the sergeant to inspect. He took it, his eyes scanning the photo, the name, the seal of the Department of Justice. He looked at her, then back at the ID. There was no question. The radio squawked again. "Control to Sergeant Phillips. Identity confirmed. Deputy U.S. Marshal Lena Washington, active and in good standing. Eastern District Command is on the line, sir. They want to know the status of their officer." Sergeant Phillips handed the credentials back to Lena with a deference that bordered on reverence. "Marshal," he said, his voice low and respectful, "my apologies for my officer's confusion. The scene is yours. How would you like to proceed?" The shift was total. Final. The local police were no longer in charge. Federal jurisdiction had descended upon this small-town gas station. Officer Miller stood frozen, a statue of disgrace, as his colleagues began the process of properly arresting the four would-be robbers, cuffing them and reading them their rights with a professionalism that had been conspicuously absent just moments before. Lena looked at the young gas station attendant who was standing nearby, his phone still in his hand. "Did you get all of that?" she asked him. The kid, whose name tag read Kevin, nodded, his eyes wide. "Yes, ma'am. The whole thing." "Don't delete it," Lena said. "Don't post it online. Just hold on to it. Someone will be in touch with you to get a copy as official evidence." "Yes, ma'am," Kevin repeated, his voice filled with awe. She then looked at the woman in the minivan, who gave her a thumbs up. Documentation. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "It's the only weapon that lasts." The reckoning had begun, but it was far from over. This wasn't just about 4 failed criminals and 1 incompetent cop. It was about the machine that produced them. And Lena Washington was about to take a wrench to his gears. The next 48 hours were a blur of methodical procedure. The Sunoco gas station was cordoned off with yellow tape, becoming a federal crime scene. FBI agents dispatched from the nearest field office arrived to process the scene, their quiet competence a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. The 4 suspects were transported not to the local jail, but to a federal holding facility. They were no longer facing a few years in state prison. They were facing decades under federal sentencing guidelines, with no possibility of parole. Lena spent most of that time in a borrowed office at the local courthouse, a place her father had walked for 40 years. She gave her official statement to the FBI. She spoke with Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chen, a sharp, no-nonsense prosecutor from the Eastern District. He had flown in himself, a sign of how seriously they were taking the incident. "This is outrageous, Marshal," Chen said, sitting across a metal desk from her. He was a compact man with an intensity that seemed to radiate from him. An assault on a federal officer is an assault on the justice system itself. But the actions of this officer Miller, that's a different kind of poison. "It's not uncommon," Lena said, her voice devoid of emotion. She was in professional mode now, the daughter on leave replaced by the seasoned officer of the court. He saw what he was conditioned to see. "That's not an excuse," Chen countered. "It's a diagnosis of a sickness. We're pursuing federal charges against the 4 assailants. But I also want to open a civil rights investigation into this officer and his department, a pattern and practice investigation. We need to know if this is an isolated incident or standard operating procedure." "It's standard operating procedure," Lena said simply. Chen leaned forward. "Can you prove that?" Lena thought of her father, of his quiet work at the big oak table. "I think I know someone who can." That evening she sat with her father in his study. The room was lined with books, floor to ceiling. It smelled of old paper and leather and pipe tobacco, though her father hadn't smoked a pipe in 20 years. The scent of memory. She explained the situation, the details of the incident, the conversation with AUSA Chen. Her father listened patiently, his hands steepled under his chin, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he stood up, walked over to a heavy filing cabinet in the corner, and unlocked it with a small brass key. He pulled open the bottom drawer. It was filled with dozens of neatly labeled manila folders. He lifted one out, then another, and another. He placed them on the large mahogany desk in front of her. The stack was nearly a foot high. "What is this?" Lena asked. "Documentation," her father said, his voice soft, but resonant with the weight of years. He opened the top folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, notarized affidavits, handwritten letters, and copies of formal complaints. The folder was labeled Simmons Versus. Sheriff's Department, 1988. He opened another. Traffic stops. Route 9 corridor, 1995 to 2001. Another. Wrongful arrest, Jackson case, 2007. "For 30 years, Nachifsidi," Judge Washington said, "people in this community, mostly black and brown folks, have been coming to me after they've been chewed up by the machine. They couldn't get justice through official channels. The complaints would disappear. The internal affairs investigations would find no wrongdoing. So I told them to write it down, to get it notarized, to keep a record. I became an unofficial archive of injustice." He looked at Lena, his eyes shining with a fierce, quiet pride. "I always knew a day would come when someone would have the power not just to listen, but to act. I believe that day is today. This is the pattern. This is the practice." Lena stared at the folders, at the decades of carefully preserved pain and frustration. It was the box of evidence, the weapon her father had been patiently building his entire life. It was stone. The next morning, Lena and her father met with AUSA Chin and a team of Department of Justice lawyers. They spread the contents of the folders across a massive conference table. The stories poured out, a litany of casual contempt, performative authority, and institutional protection. A history of traffic stops that always escalated, of complaints that vanished, of a system designed to protect its own. Officer Miller wasn't an anomaly. He was a product. He was a perfect expression of the department's culture. Kevin, the gas station attendant, provided his cell phone video, the station's high-definition CCTV footage, which Kevin had made sure to secure before the police could, corroborated every detail of Lena's account. It showed the four men stalking her. It showed their aggression. It showed her calm compliance. And most damningly, it showed Officer Miller arriving on the scene and immediately targeting her, ignoring the four men who had already assumed a position of surrender. The audio captured every word, from the robber's threats to Miller's sneering dismissal of her identity to the final, panicked moments after the dispatcher's call. The machine, which had run smoothly in the dark for so long, was now being dragged into the bright, unforgiving light of a federal investigation. The first gear to break was Officer Miller. Faced with incontrovertible video evidence and the looming threat of federal charges for willfully violating Lena's civil rights under color of law, he was suspended without pay. The local police chief, a man named Brody, who had publicly defended Miller as a good officer who had a bad day, was forced to backtrack when the DOJ announced its formal pattern and practice investigation. His performative authority crumbled under the weight of federal oversight. 2 weeks later, as Lena's leave was coming to an end, the first indictments came down, not just for the four robbers, but for Officer Miller as well. He was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law and obstruction of justice for what the investigators determined was an attempt to file a false report before the truth of Lena's identity came out. Lena was in the kitchen with her father when she got the call from Chin. She listened, nodding occasionally, her expression calm. "Thank you, David. Keep me informed." She hung up the phone. "It's done," she said to her father. "No," Judge Washington corrected her gently. "It started." The day of Miller's arraignment in federal court, Lena was there. She didn't go in her Marshal's uniform. She wore a simple black dress. She sat in the back of the gallery, an anonymous observer. She watched as the man who had so confidently and contemptuously put her in handcuffs was led into the courtroom by two deputy U.S. Marshals, her colleagues. He was not in uniform. He wore an ill-fitting suit. His hands were cuffed behind his back. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He was being led out in the same restraints he had imposed on her. He was being processed by the very system he had so arrogantly abused. He glanced around the courtroom, his eyes wild with fear and disbelief, and for a moment his gaze met Lena's. In her eyes he didn't find gloating or triumph. He found nothing. Just the calm, dispassionate gaze of justice itself. It was colder than any hatred. The investigation into the department, fueled by her father's archives, led to a federal consent decree, a legally binding agreement that would force systemic reform. New training, a civilian oversight committee, transparent data collection on traffic stops, and use of force. The machine wasn't destroyed, but it was being dismantled and rebuilt, piece by painful piece. Chief Brody announced his retirement shortly thereafter. The developer from Charlotte quietly withdrew his proposal to rezone the old mill. The political winds had shifted. On her last day of leave, Lena drove to the Sunoco station. It was just a gas station again. The yellow tape was gone. Cars were fueling up. People were buying coffee and lottery tickets. Life had returned to its normal rhythms. She pulled up to pump number 3. As she got out of her car, the door to the station opened and Kevin, the young attendant, came out. He saw her and a slow smile spread across his face. He nodded at her. A small gesture of recognition, of respect, of shared knowledge. Lena nodded back. She filled her tank. The smell of gasoline sharp in the air. The sun was warm on her skin. She looked around at the ordinary, peaceful scene. She felt not a sense of victory, but a quiet sense of restoration. The line had been breached, and she had held it. She had restored the order of things, not just for herself, but for all the names in her father's folders. Later that evening, she sat with her father on the back porch, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance in the twilight. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of jasmine. They didn't speak for a long time. You know, her father said finally, his voice a soft rumble in the gathering dark, your mother would have been so proud of you. Lena felt an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel through the entire ordeal. Not anger, not fear, but a profound, aching love for this man, for the memory of her mother, for this place that had forged her. She reached out and took his hand, his skin thin and papery over the strong bones. I know, Dad, she said. I know. She had one day of leave remaining. Tomorrow she would drive back to her life, to the courthouses and the warrants. She would go back to her work as a small, steady gear in the vast machinery of federal justice. But something had changed. The fight was no longer just professional. It was personal. She had looked into the face of the machine in her own hometown, and she had made it blink. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would spend the rest of her life making sure it never looked at anyone that way again. The light faded completely, leaving only the pinpricks of the fireflies against the deep Carolina night. It was quiet. It was peaceful. It was a peace that had been earned. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.